Okay, guys. So hi, this is Miss Funk. I tried to do the Skype thing yesterday, well, this morning, because I'm coming to you on Friday night or on Wednesday night. Tried to do the Skype thing with the Geo Kids, and it was an epic fail. So I am trying this, gonna pre-record this video, post it on Edsby, and let you guys take the notes from that. And it's really almost like I'm there doing this on the smart board, except for, of course, you're not there to ask me questions. So I will try to anticipate any questions, and then if you have them, send them to me on Remind or on Edsby, and I will absolutely answer them whenever I see them. So hopefully this will work well for us. Fortunately, logic is one of the easier topics that we're going to be going over, but we do have a lot in here. So I want to make sure that we're getting everything to the best of our abilities. So last class, you guys were instructed to read over section 3.2 on statements and negations. So you all should know what a statement is. A statement is something that can be a sentence that can be judged to be true or false. For example, if I were to say, my name is Miss Funk, that would be a statement. And that would be, in fact, a true statement. If I were to ask, is my name Miss Funk, then that's not a statement, that's a question. And we only deal with statements when we're talking about logic. So once we've got some statements, it's not super duper interesting to talk about just simple statements. We usually talk about them in terms of compound statements that are connected in some way, shape, or form. So the various ways that we connect statements are called connectives, and I've gotten them written up here for you. So we have and, which the symbol for that is a little word pointing caret. The symbol for or is the reverse, a downward pointing caret. If and then is an arrow. And if and only if is an arrow pointing both directions, like that. All right, so we're going to start out by translating from English into symbolic form. And I apologize in advance that my handwriting is kind of terrible because I'm writing on my iPad, and that's just not going to be great. So for example 1, statement, we're going to let P be the statement, it is after 5 p.m., and Q be the statement, they are working. So we want to put into symbolic form, it is after 5 p.m. and they are working. So let's take a look at what two statements we have here. It is after 5 p.m. That is going to be statement P. They are working is going to be statement Q. And the and, we know, is that upward pointing arrow. So our symbolic form is going to be P and Q. Just like that. Very simple. Okay? Same two statements, but this time we've got it is after 5 p.m. and they are not working. So, it is after 5 p.m. We know that's P. But they are not working, that's not Q, is it? Q was they are working. This is they are not working. So that's going to be the negation of Q. And by the way, negation, that's how I usually write it with the squiggly line. You may see it typed like that, I think. Your book uses the squigglies. IB, I think, uses that way. It might be that way. I don't remember. Anyway. But regardless, I will try to always use the squigglies. Okay, so then we've got the and. So P and not Q. Again, pretty straightforward. That's really all there is to that. All right, or statements. It's important for you all to be aware that in logic and in math, whenever we use the word or, we are using it as an inclusive or. So, I visited London or Paris. That could mean that I visited London, or that I visited Paris, or both. And that's kind of not exactly the way that we're used to seeing it in plain English. If I tell you that you can have a cookie or chips, you usually think of it as one or the other, but not both. But in logic, we are always going to be using this as an inclusive or, meaning it's totally okay if it's both. Okay. So, example 2. Statement P, the bill receives majority approval. Statement Q, the bill becomes a law. So we are going to write the following sentence symbolically. The bill receives majority approval, or the bill becomes a law. So the bill receives majority approval. That is, of course, statement P. The bill becomes a law. That's going to be statement Q. Since we've got the or, this statement is just P or Q. That's it. Pretty straightforward. Part B. The bill receives majority approval, or the bill does not become a law. So again, the bill receives majority approval. That's going to be P. The bill does not become a law is going to be not Q. Oh, I just discovered how to do something new on here. That's awesome. All right. So this one is going to be P or not Q. All right. I hope this is making sense. This is the easier stuff. So we'll get a little bit more complicated as we go on. And again, and just so you're aware, we have not talked even a little bit about whether our statements are true or false at this point. We will get to that when we get into truth tables, which is in section 3.3, which is next week on Monday, and I will be back because I will no longer be contagious. Fingers crossed. All right. So, if-then statements. So the first sentence I have written here, all poets are writers. That's something that, that's a statement, these quantified statements that you looked at in section 3.1. We can rewrite that statement as an if-then statement. If a person is a poet, then they are a writer. So in that case, P is going to be a person is a poet, and Q is going to be a person is a writer. So that then we could write this as P arrow Q. And I'll sometimes abbreviate that. You can say it as if P then Q, or sometimes I'll say P implies Q. But if P then Q is really what we have going on here. All right, so example 3, we've got statement P, a person is a father, and statement Q, a person is a male. We're going to write in symbolic form, if a person is a father, then that person is a male. And frequently what will happen is we will end up with our statements actually not being identical, or our compound sentence statements not being identical to the simple statements. We just reworded them slightly to make it more grammatically pleasing. That's totally fine, as long as we're not changing the meaning of anything. So, if a person is a father, so P is going to be right here, then that person is a male. That's Q. So this statement is P, if P, then Q. And we're ignoring the fact that we're ignoring the reality of transgendered parents here, obviously. All right. So then part B, same statements. If a person is a male, then that person is a father. So going back to what we looked at before, a person is a male, that was Q. So this is statement Q. That person is a father, this is statement P. So this one is going to be if Q, then P. All right, and then lastly, if a person is not a male, so since this one has a not in it, that means we're going to be dealing with a negation. Not Q. Then that person is not a father. That's going to be not P. So if not Q, then not P. All right. Normally I would say questions on that. You're not there. You're all at home. It's 9 o'clock at night. Hopefully you don't have any questions. If you do, message me on Etsy. Okay. So I have written here a whole lot of different variants of ways that we can have ways that we can have conditional statements. That's what these are called, is conditional statements in English. I have them written using the symbolic P and Q. So of course we have if P then Q. And then we have Q if P. So, for example, a person is a male if that person is a father. P is sufficient for Q. Being a father is sufficient for being a male. Q is necessary for P. Being a male is necessary for being a father. P only if Q. A person is a father only if that person is a male. And only if Q, P. Only if a person is a male is that person is a father. Some of those are really super duper awkward, and that's okay. That's just the reality of the situation. Sometimes we're going to have statements that are given to us in some of these more awkward forms, and we need to be able to interpret them that they are, in fact, conditional statements and can be written symbolically. So we're going to see an example of that next. So example 4, Statement P, we suffer huge we suffer huge budget deficits. Statement Q, we control military spending. So our statement is controlling military spending is necessary for not suffering huge budget deficits. All right? So, controlling military spending. Now, would we say controlling military spending as a sentence? No. They've reworded it to make it sound better in the compound statement. And that's going to be statement Q. Is necessary for, so notice that that's one of those expressions that we saw in the last slide, not suffering huge budget deficits. Statement P was we suffer huge budget deficits. So this, since we're not suffering huge budget deficits, that's going to be not P. So if we go back and look at is necessary for, Q is necessary for P, was how we would write P, if P then Q. So then that tells us that the second part, not P, is actually our hypothesis, and then Q is going to be our conclusion. All right. So let's move on. If and only if statements. So, if we've got a if and then statement that is true, I know we said we're not really talking about true statements here, but for this one we kind of have to. The question is, can we reverse the hypothesis, which is also known as the antecedent, and the conclusion, which is also known as the consequent, and still have a true statement? That's what we're trying to figure out. So if we go back to one of our previous problems, the ones with the father and the males, if a person is a father, then that person is a male. We would expect that to be a true statement, right? That makes logical sense. We are used to calling male parents fathers in our society. Okay? But when we switch those, the hypothesis and conclusion, when we switch P and Q, if a person is a male, then that person is a father. Well, I've got a whole classroom full of male students, and as far as I'm aware, none of y'all are fathers. So that is not necessarily true. We cannot conclude that that is true. So only when we're dealing with statements where both P, if P then Q, and if Q then P, those are the only, and if both of those are true, then we can write it as P and then a double arrow Q. P, if and only if Q. And that's called a biconditional. And if and only if can be abbreviated as IFF in case you ever see that. I don't usually use that, but it might come up. Okay, so in example 5, in your textbook, they give us a little table that shows us the words with the most meanings in the Oxford English Dictionary. And they tell us that the word set has 464 different meanings in the OED, which, cool, I never knew that. So, we are saying that P is the word is set, and Q is the word has 464 meanings. So, the word is set, if and only if the word has 464 meanings. Well, the word is set, that's going to be statement P. the word has 464 meanings. That's going to be statement Q. So since we're dealing with if and only if, that is that double arrow symbol with the arrows pointing in either direction. And that is how we're going to write it. P, if and only if, Q. All right. So then we're going to write and do another example, same statements. The word does not have 464 meanings. So that's got to be a negation since we're dealing with not. And that's going to be a negation of Q. So this is not Q. The word is not set. So that's going to have to be not P. So this is not Q, if and only if, not P. And that is our answer. All right. Okie dokes. So, sometimes we'll be given symbolic statements with parentheses. For example, if we have not parentheses P and Q, then that means that we're negating the entire statement. We would say it is not true that, and then we would say whatever P and Q is. In contrast, if we don't have parentheses and we've got a negation symbol, then that means that we're just negating the first statement, in this case statement P. So not P and Q, which of course is going to probably have a different meaning than it is not true that P and Q. So let's do an example and see that in actual English. So, example 6. Statement P, she is wealthy. Statement Q, she is happy. So in part A, we are doing not parentheses P and Q. So let's do without the negation first. P and Q, she is wealthy and she is happy. So, if we want to make that whole statement negated, we would say it is not true that she is wealthy and she is happy. Okay? And we'll talk next class about what this means in terms of truth values of these statements. Right now, we're just dealing with writing the statements in in either English or symbolic form. All right. So then we have not P and Q. So P was she is wealthy. So she is not wealthy and she is happy. So you can see that that is not the same thing as what we wrote in the previous part of the previous example. Sometimes they'll both be true, sometimes they'll both be false, but these are not the same sentence. I hope you guys can all see that. All right. So then lastly, not the negation of the statement P or Q. So let's do the regular statement before the negation. She is wealthy or she is happy. So then when we negate that, it is not true that she is wealthy or she is happy. Okay? Alrighty. Example 7. So now we are getting into more complex statements where they've got parentheses, and the parentheses tell us which statements are grouped together. Usually when we're expressing this in English, we will use commas to express those parentheses. So we've got statement P, a student misses lecture. Statement Q, a student studies. And statement R, a student fails. So, for our symbolic statement, we've got Q and not P. Sorry, if Q and not P, then not R. And notice how I sped up and like sort of blurred together the Q and not P, because that part all goes together. That's going inside. That's the hypothesis or the antecedent of this conditional statement. So Q and not P would be a student studies and does not miss lecture. So we're going to say if a student studies and does not miss lecture. So notice how that entire compound statement is going right after the if before the comma. Then not R, R was a student fails, so then not R would be the student does not fail. And that makes sense. If a student studies and does not miss lecture, then the student does not fail. All right. So now let's go to part B, same statements. This time we're doing Q and if not P, then not R. So Q, a student studies. And I'm actually going to put a comma right after the word studies, because that doesn't really have anything to do with what we're about to say. That's a completely separate statement. And if, let's go back and check what P was. P was a student misses lecture. So not P was if the student doesn't miss lecture. R was the student fails, so not R would be the student doesn't fail. Then the student doesn't fail. All right? So we can talk more about the truth value of this on Monday, but when we're saying a student studies, period, end of story. Okay? If the student doesn't miss lecture, then the student doesn't fail. Basically, what we're saying here is both of these things have to be true in order for the overall statement to be true. The student has to study, and if the student doesn't miss lecture, then the student doesn't fail. That has to also be true. Okay? The dominance of connectives matters when we are writing statements in symbolic form when we're given them in English. The negation is, of course, the not, and that is the least dominant. Then after that are conjunction, which is the and disjunction, which is the or. Those are equally dominant. The conditional is if then, and the biconditional is if and only if. If and only if is going to be the most dominant of all of the connectives. Okay? So now let's go to our next example. Here we are given a statement. I do not pass the course, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. All right? So, if and only if, that's going to be the most dominant connective here. So, we can see that I study hard and I pass the final. That's its own compound statement. So that's going to need to have parentheses around it. All right? We were not given any letters to represent these statements. So let's let P be I fail the course. Which means that I do not fail the course would be then not P. Let's let Q be I study hard. And R is going to be I pass the final. All right? So, we know we're going to end up with not P. We know we're going to have if and only if, so the double arrows. We're going to have parentheses around the next statement. I study hard is going to be Q, and I pass the final is going to be R. So not P, if and only if, Q and R. Okay? Slightly different. We've got a comma here. That tells us that we've got parentheses around that first sentence, that first compound statement. I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard, comma, and I pass the final. So that comma is taking out the dominance of the if and only if connective. Now I need to have parentheses around the if and only if part, not around the and part. So I'm going to use the same statements, which means that I do not fail the course. That's going to be not P. If and only if I study hard, Q. But then I'm going to put parentheses around the biconditional and R. So that little comma actually makes a big difference. It's really important that we pay attention to where those commas are and we keep track of them to ensure that we are putting parentheses in the correct spot. So in your homework, which is homework, I guess 23, whatever the next homework is, the 3.2 homework. In your homework, you're going to be writing statements in symbolic form. You're going to be writing statements in words. And then we will pick up there on Monday. Hopefully this worked well for you guys. Please, please, please send me questions if you have them. And I will see you on Monday.